She wasn't just the principal of my school, she became the woman who taught me the kind of lessons no book could ever hold. The school was nearly empty by the time she asked me to follow her to her office. The long hallway carried the faint smell of old wood and chalk dust, the kind of scent that feels heavy with memories. Each step echoed, reminding me that no one else was around. Her office door stood open, a warm glow spilling out from a desk lamp that softened the edges of the room. It wasn't the cold, distant space I expected from someone in her position. The bookshelf stretched high, filled with novels, journals, and volumes that looked well read, their spines gently worn. A small pot of tea sat on a side table, steam curling upward like a quiet invitation. "Sit," she said, gesturing toward a chair across from her desk. Her tone was firm but not commanding, and somehow it put me at ease. I lowered myself into the chair, my hands fidgeting in my lap, while she settled gracefully into hers. "You know," she began, her voice steady, "not every lesson worth learning is found in these books." Her fingers brushed the cover of one lying open on the desk. She didn't look at the book, though, she looked at me, and that made all the difference. There was something disarming about her eyes. They didn't just see, they lingered, as though they were trying to read the pages of someone's soul. For a moment, I forgot about the titles on the shelves, the piles of papers waiting for her signature. All I could think about was how her presence made the room feel smaller, more intimate. "I've noticed you," she continued, folding her hands neatly on the desk. "You're distracted, as if you're standing at a crossroads and can't decide which way to step." The truth of her words hit harder than I expected. My throat tightened, and I looked down, unsure how much of myself she could already see. She leaned forward slightly, her hand resting near mine on the desk. Close, so close I could feel the faint warmth of her skin bridging the air between us. She didn't touch me, but the possibility of it sent a quiet current through me. "You don't have to have it all figured out now," she said gently. "But don't waste your time trying to live someone else's idea of your life." The hum of silence filled the space after her words, heavier than any lecture, yet strangely comforting. I could hear the faint ticking of the clock on the wall, could feel the steadiness of my own heartbeat as if it was trying to keep pace with hers. That night, under the soft lamp glow and her steady gaze, I realized she wasn't simply a principal offering advice. She was a guide into something unspoken, something far deeper than the lessons printed in ink. The next time I found myself in her office, the air felt different. It wasn't the formality of a student meeting a principal anymore. It was quieter, softer, as though the walls themselves leaned in to listen. She poured tea into 2 porcelain cups, her movements unhurried, deliberate, like someone who believed in the value of small rituals. When she handed me the cup, her fingertips brushed mine. It was the lightest touch, accidental perhaps, but it sent a ripple through me that the warmth of the tea couldn't disguise. I pretended not to notice, yet my chest tightened with the awareness that she was close enough for her presence to change the very air I breathed. She settled back into her chair and, for the first time, let down a guard I didn't even realize she carried. "You know," she said quietly, "people think someone in my position has it all together. That I never doubt, never falter." Her gaze drifted toward the bookshelves as though searching for a word that didn't exist in print. I stayed silent, not out of hesitation, but because I felt her words deserved the space to land. Her lips curved into a faint smile, though it held more sadness than joy. "The truth is, leadership is a lonely place. You give so much, decisions, guidance, discipline, but at the end of the day, you walk into an empty house. No one claps for you when the doors close." Her honesty startled me. This was the woman who carried herself with unshakable grace, who commanded respect with a glance. Yet here she was, speaking with a quiet vulnerability that revealed her as something more than untouchable authority. She was human. She was a woman. I shifted forward, resting the teacup on my knee. "Doesn't it feel heavy?" I asked softly. She looked at me then, truly looked, and I felt as though she saw past my age, past my uncertainty, right into the core of who I was. "Heavier than I admit," she whispered. But sometimes, just being heard makes it lighter. Her words lingered in the room, carried by the faint aroma of jasmine rising from our cups. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, it was intimate. It was the kind of silence where every small movement meant something. When she reached across the desk to pass me a file, her hand brushed mine again. This time it wasn't rushed. It stayed an instant longer, as though her skin was reluctant to let go. In that pause, I understood something. She wasn't just teaching me about courage or choices. She was showing me her heart, one hesitant glance, one trembling touch at a time. The rain had stopped just before dusk, leaving the courtyard damp and glistening under the pale glow of the street lamps. She locked her office door with a quiet click, then glanced at me with a small, knowing smile. "It's late. You shouldn't walk alone." Her voice carried the same balance of authority and warmth I'd come to recognize, but tonight, it felt less like an instruction and more like an invitation. I nodded, falling into step beside her as we moved toward the school gates. The building behind us faded into silence, its empty windows watching as though they knew we were carrying something unspoken between us. Our footsteps echoed across the path, water still pooling in shallow dips. The air smelled fresh, heavy with the scent of rain-soaked earth. She walked with quiet confidence, her hands folded loosely in front of her, while I kept mine tucked into my pockets to keep them from trembling. At one point, she slowed, her heel slipping slightly against the slick ground. Instinct pulled me closer. My hand reached out before I could think, catching her at the waist. For a heartbeat, she leaned into me, her body soft, her balance resting on mine. The world narrowed to the space between us, her perfume, faint and floral, the warmth of her side against my palm, the rise of her breath as she steadied herself. "Careful," I murmured, my voice rougher than I intended. She looked up at me then, and there was something in her eyes I hadn't seen before, something that wasn't just gratitude. A quiet acknowledgement, a spark of awareness that matched the thundering in my chest. And then, just as quickly, she straightened, smoothing the moment away with composed grace. "Thank you," she said, her tone gentle, almost cautious. We continued walking, but the rhythm had changed. Our steps fell in sync, our silence no longer empty but filled with a kind of charge that words couldn't carry. Every brush of her sleeve against mine, every pause in her stride felt amplified. By the time we reached the gate, the night air had cooled, wrapping us in its stillness. She stopped there, her hand resting lightly on the iron bar, and turned toward me. "You notice things," she said softly, as though it was a compliment she hadn't planned to give. "Most people don't." I didn't know how to respond, so I simply held her gaze. It was enough. Her smile came slowly, not polished or professional, but quiet and personal. And in that moment, standing outside the empty school with rain still clinging to the earth, I realized the lesson wasn't about guidance anymore. It was about presence. About closeness. About her. The gate stood half open, its iron bars casting long shadows across the ground. We lingered there, neither of us in a rush to break the stillness that had settled between us. The faint glow of the street lamp painted her features in warm light, softening the sharp edges of the woman I had always seen as untouchable. She rested her hand on the gate, fingers tapping lightly as though she was debating something inside herself. Then, without quite meaning to, she let her other hand drift toward me, brushing against my forearm. It was a simple touch, gentle, almost hesitant, but it carried a weight that went far beyond the gesture itself. I felt the warmth of her skin even after she pulled back, as if it had left an imprint not just on my arm but somewhere deeper. My heart pounded in a rhythm too fast for the quiet night, and I wondered if she could hear it. Her smile appeared slowly, curving with a softness I hadn't seen before. "Some lessons," she said quietly, "can't be written down. You feel them." Her words hung in the cool air, and I knew she wasn't talking about academics anymore. She was telling me something without saying it directly, giving me permission to understand the closeness we both felt but hadn't dared to name. I swallowed hard, searching for words that wouldn't come. The world seemed to shrink to that small patch of ground, the damp air, the faint glisten of raindrops on the gate, and the space between us that was narrowing in meaning, if not in distance. She exhaled softly, almost like a sigh, before stepping back. "You should get home," she said, her tone carrying both care and restraint. It was as if she was reminding herself of the boundaries just as much as she was reminding me. I nodded, though my chest ached with the weight of everything left unsaid. I wanted to tell her how her presence unsettled me in ways no book, no lecture, no routine ever had. I wanted to confess that every moment with her felt like stepping into a world I didn't know how to navigate. But instead, I let silence speak for me. As I walked away, I could still feel the ghost of her touch on my arm, a reminder that something had shifted. The lessons she hinted at weren't about knowledge or discipline. They were about connection, about trust, about the fragile courage it takes to let someone in. And though neither of us had spoken it aloud, I knew, the line between teacher and student, principal and young man, had blurred in a way we could no longer ignore. Rain tapped gently against the tall windows of her office, a steady rhythm that seemed to mark the silence between us. Papers were spread across the desk, but neither of us was paying much attention to them. She had asked me to help with some notes, yet what lingered in the air had nothing to do with ink or pages. We sat close, shoulders nearly brushing. Every time one of us shifted, the small movement sent a quiet ripple of awareness through the space. I could feel the warmth of her presence without even turning my head. It was in the air, in the subtle electricity that hummed between us. She leaned slightly over the desk to show me a page, her sleeve grazing my arm. The contact was fleeting, accidental perhaps, but my breath caught anyway. I glanced at her, and for a moment, her eyes lingered on mine longer than they should have. Something passed between us, soft, dangerous, undeniable. She broke it first, exhaling a laugh that was quieter than usual, more fragile. "You're too serious," she teased gently, her voice low and warm. Her laughter disarmed me, and before I could stop myself, I said something, simple, clumsy, but enough to make her laugh again. And when she did, she rested her hand lightly on my knee, just for a second, as though the gesture came naturally. The touch was brief, but it startled me more than any bold act could have. My skin burned beneath her fingers, my chest tightening with the realization of how easily the barrier between us was thinning. She withdrew quickly, clearing her throat, her composure sliding back into place. Yet I caught the faintest flicker in her eyes, a recognition that the gesture had meant more than either of us could admit. The rain outside grew heavier, drumming against the windows, wrapping us in a cocoon of sound. It felt like the world beyond her office had disappeared, leaving only the two of us in this fragile, dangerous intimacy. Neither of us spoke for a long time. The silence wasn't empty, it pulsed with everything unsaid, everything restrained. Every glance, every pause seemed to pull us closer, as though words were unnecessary and perhaps even impossible. Finally, she pushed the papers aside and looked at me directly. Her voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed the storm beneath. "You're learning quickly," she said softly, almost as if she wasn't speaking about the notes at all. I nodded, my throat too tight to respond. Because in that moment, I understood, the lessons she was giving me weren't meant for any classroom. They were written in gestures, in glances, in the delicate silence we were both trying, and failing, to resist. Weeks had passed since that rain-soaked evening in her office, yet the memory of it lingered in me like a quiet flame. Every glance, every pause, every accidental touch had carried us closer to something neither of us could ignore. And yet, we never spoke of it outright. We lived in the silence, in the fragile space where restraint and desire met. One evening, after another long day, I lingered outside her office once more. The door stood slightly ajar, golden lamplight spilling into the hallway. I hesitated, then knocked softly. "Come in," her voice called, calm as always. When I stepped inside, I found her seated at her desk, but this time there were no papers scattered across it. Only the lamp, a single cup of tea, and a stillness that felt different, expectant. She looked up at me with a softness that seemed to have shed the weight of titles and roles. For once, she wasn't the principal. She was simply herself. "I wanted to thank you," I began, my voice quieter than I intended. "For everything. For listening. For teaching me more than I expected." Her lips curved into a faint smile, the kind that always seemed to reach her eyes before her mouth. She rose from her chair and walked slowly toward me, her steps measured but certain. When she stopped in front of me, the distance between us was smaller than it had ever been. "You've learned," she said softly, her gaze steady, "but you've also taught me. More than you realize." I couldn't find words. The air between us held too much weight, too much truth. My heart raced, not from fear, but from the realization that this moment was different, that it was ours. Her hand lifted, hesitant at first, then certain. The back of her fingers brushed lightly against my cheek, a tender gesture that carried more meaning than any confession could. The warmth of her skin, the gentleness of her touch, it was enough to silence every doubt, every question. Neither of us rushed. We didn't need to. The quiet hum of her breath, the soft glow of the lamp reflecting in her eyes, the closeness of her presence, it was all the resolution I needed. We stood there in silence, not as principal and student, not as woman and young man bound by roles, but simply as two souls who had found each other in an unexpected place. And in that stillness, in that tender touch, I knew, she had been right all along. Some lessons can't be written down. Some lessons can only be felt.